So the title of the session today is Organizational Culture, but there's a background behind that. For the last 20 years or so, I've been fascinated by why big companies sometimes fail and are disrupted by smaller companies. And in doing that research and consulting and writing cases, it became clear to me that culture is one of the reasons that companies sometimes find it difficult to change. So the DX, the digital transformation in Japan, of course, is affecting lots of Japanese companies, especially some of the older, well-known companies, like Hitachi and Toshiba and some of the other companies, big companies, great companies, but struggling with the change. And so I thought it might be interesting and useful for us to talk a little bit about culture as both a potential competitive advantage, but also a competitive disadvantage. That is, the culture that makes them successful in one business may not be the right culture for the new digital world. And my experience is that often leaders, even though they understand that culture is important, they don't really have a good sense for how to manage it. They acknowledge that it's important, but since they don't really know how to define it and manage it, they tend not to actually actively try to change it. And so what I thought we would do is I would give you a way of thinking that people can actually do something about and show how you can align culture with strategy and then illustrate it with two very successful culture change efforts, one in the United States with Microsoft. If you followed Microsoft over the last 5 years or so, you know that they have really transformed themselves under their CEO, Satya Nadella. And so I thought I would use Microsoft as an example to illustrate how senior leaders can actually change culture. And then I would use a Japanese company, AGC, what used to be Asahi Glass Company, that under Shimamura-san has actually transformed the company as well. And so I hope at the end of this, what you're going to come away with is a sense for how you can think about culture and actually manage culture, especially in a world of change. So let me suggest, I want to answer 5 questions. And we want to talk about the DX, but before we can talk about the DX, I think it's important that we be clear about what culture is. People acknowledge that culture is important, but unless we can be pretty clear about what it is, then it's going to be very difficult to manage. So let's start by defining culture. So, you come from around the world, you all travel. When Japanese come to the United States, they can see things that are obviously different. It feels odd when Americans go to Japan or other countries, we can see things that looks differently. So we all understand that there is such a thing as national culture. But just to give you one small example, if you go to Finland, people are very quiet. They don't talk a lot. They keep their distance. They're very modest. If you go to Italy, in a way, it's almost the opposite, that people talk a lot, they stand close to each other. So if you think about culture as values, which many people do, it's not useful because culture is not really values. Culture, national culture and organizational culture is really expectations about how people behave. How do we expect good people to behave? When people talk about values, you can't manage values. Companies, for instance, can say this is what we stand for, but you can't manage them. So my encouragement for you is to think about culture not as, for instance, in Japan, where people often think about culture as bunka or DNA. This applies to the Japanese culture, but it doesn't help us in organizations because you can't change DNA. Especially Jaha as a biomedical scientist, you understand that DNA is pretty much fixed. If you think about culture, though, as Koro no Yoshiki, it is possible to change. Think about culture as the pattern of behavior in organizations, not values, but the pattern of behavior. What it is really is a social control system. That is, when people go to work in an organization, We want to fit in. We want to be accepted. We don't want to make a mistake. And so we look around and we try to figure out how should I behave to be seen as a good person? If everybody agrees that here is how you need to behave, and by the way, here is how you should not behave, if there's great agreement about that, then that is a social control system. So if I come to work at IGPI, for instance, and there's great agreement about how people should behave, and I don't behave that way, then I'm likely to be excluded, or people are likely to tell me, look, if you want to be effective here, this is how you want to behave. So think about culture, not as something vague, but as the pattern of behavior that's reinforced by people, our bosses, the leaders, our colleagues, and the systems, how we get selected, how we get trained, how we get promoted. If you think about culture as the pattern of behavior, we can now manage that. We understand how to shape patterns of behavior. All right. It's interesting. I've had the chance over the last 5-6 years to do some work with General Motors. The CEO of General Motors is Mary Barra. And Mary Barra, when she came to work at General Motors, had a big culture change effort that she was responsible for. There'd been a technical problem with ignition switches. People knew about it. The company didn't do anything about it. And we've actually been tracking the culture change at General Motors for the last 6 years. And Mary says, she hates the word culture. She doesn't use the word culture. She thinks about culture as behavior. This is Doug McMillon, the CEO of Walmart. Walmart is a very strong culture organization. If you go to work in an organization, public or private, doesn't matter. If you go to work in an organization and there's great agreement about what the right way to behave is, and we can see people being rewarded for that or punished if they don't behave, that's a strong culture organization. Most organizations are not strong culture. They have values, but they often don't take those values and drive them into a set of behaviors. Oftentimes what happens is that leads to a certain cynicism because people say, well, the company says we stand for teamwork, but I can see people being promoted who are not team players. Think about culture as the pattern of behavior. And as I said, we know how to manage that. This is a list of strong culture companies. And by the way, this is not an American thing. This is Kanabo in Japan, it's Kodak in the United States, it's Karstadt in Germany. This is not just private sector companies. These are military organizations, religious organizations. All of these are strong culture organizations, and they're all managed the same way. That's what makes this useful for us. Now, the content of the culture, the pattern of behaviors are different, but the way it's managed is the same. Culture is a social construction, and what that means is, most of you have worked for other organizations, and you go to an organization and the organization has a culture. And if you say, well, why does this culture exist? Well, there's no objective reason. Culture exists when people agree this is the right way to behave. Leaders can start with values, but you can't manage values. If we're going to manage culture, we have to be explicit about what are the expectations about behaviors that we need. Now, if you're very clear about what the behaviors are you need, now we can measure them, we can train people to them, and we can change them. So how do you manage culture? Well, the psychology of it is that when we are in situations where there is very strong information saying this is how you should behave, then that drives behavior. So here are the 5 levers that every strong culture, private or public, around the world, every strong culture uses. Each of these levers is a way of sending signals to people saying this is how we need you to behave. So the first lever comes from our leaders. What is it that the senior leaders constantly say? What's important? And more importantly, how do they themselves behave? We watch our leaders, we try to figure out what's important, what are they really thinking about? And if they constantly send signals saying this is how to behave, that signals to us that this is how I should behave. Okay? The second lever, again, this is a way of signaling to people what the right behaviors are, is we get people involved. Why is that important? Because when we're involved, when people are listening to us, they hear us, then we feel psychological ownership. So strong culture organizations typically have processes that get people involved. They have town halls, they have surveys, they have pulse checks, they have, sort of Q&A with the senior leaders. The third lever are rewards, but not money. We're talking here about recognition, status, approval. So if I come to work at IGPI as a young person and I want to fit in and I want to succeed, I'm going to look around and I'm going to see who's getting promoted and what is that person doing? How are they behaving? So when we line up status and recognition and approval to signal this is the right way to behave, that's a very strong signal about what the culture is. The fourth lever are symbols and stories about who really stands for the culture. And the last lever are we take our HR systems, our recruitment systems, our selection systems, our training systems, and we line those up. Now, think about what it's like to go to work in an organization where all these levers are sending the same signal. Your leaders are saying one thing, they're listening to you, and you're making choices. You can see people being rewarded. There are examples of the culture, and the HR systems are rewarding people. These are the levers that all strong culture organization uses, and you should think about it in your own experience. Think about sports teams. Think about schools. Think about where you've been in places that are strong cultures. So now, so why is this important? Well, and why is it important for the DX? So here's why. This is a list of industries, and there are really two things about this industry. The first is every one of these industries is being disrupted. The DX is affecting all these industries. I mean, if you think about the automobile industry, they're being disrupted by technology, autonomous driving, ride sharing and new business models, shifts in consumer preferences, changes in government regulation. The other thing that is more interesting about this is if you look at what's going on in those industries, what you see are great companies failing. And this is not just an American thing, by the way. This is happening faster in the US because of our capital markets, but this is, I said, is Kanabo in Japan and, Kodak in the US. And if you really study these bankruptcies and you ask, well, why did they get into trouble? What you see, what you learn is they got into trouble not because of technology. They got into trouble because they had leaders who couldn't play two games at the same time, who couldn't succeed in their existing business and make the transition to new businesses. This is becoming more important, and this is one of the reasons I think the DX has become more salient to people, is that the pace of change is increasing. We read about this when we read business journals. The pace of change is increasing. It's true. The rate of penetration of new technologies, the internet, mobility, artificial intelligence, that is penetrating faster. What we're seeing are great companies becoming either irrelevant, less important, or in some cases being acquired, or in some cases actually going bankrupt. So the digital transformation is really accelerating this process. The term that, we hear some people use is this notion of VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, sort of, ambiguous. Because of that, the question then becomes, can the leaders help their companies transform? Part of that question is strategy, but to execute the strategy means that you have to align the culture. There have been some studies done, interesting studies, over the last 20 years or so, showing that it's culture that acts as a source of inertia, that holds companies back, even when they set the strategy. Now, what's interesting about this example, a very positive example, I think, is that if you look at Kodak and Fujifilm, they are head-to-head competitors. But what you see is over the last 20 plus years is Fujifilm is now 20 times the size of Kodak. Kodak went bankrupt in 2012. They're selling off their intellectual property. Why? Why was Fujifilm able to succeed and Kodak fail? Well, the answer is leadership. Komori-san, who just stepped down at Fujifilm about 18 months ago, in 2000, Fujifilm actually figured out how to take the strengths of Fujifilm and move it into growth businesses like cosmetics, like regenerative medicine. So culture and strategy are critical. The problem is that leaders oftentimes, as we've said, don't pay enough attention to culture. It is something that people identify with and are reluctant to change. And this is a quote from one of the managing partner of one of the world's leading venture capital firms, a fellow named Ben Horowitz. And what he says is exactly right. He said, there are lots of failed companies that had great cultures. All right. So how do we make this happen? We set a strategy. Once we know our strategy, we can then say, all right, if I'm going to execute this strategy, here are the things I have to do. There's been a very long tradition of research showing that fit leads to performance. Alignment leads to successful execution of strategy. I mean, you only have to think about it for a second. Imagine we had a strategy. We knew what our key success factors were, but we didn't have the right people. They weren't motivated. We weren't measuring the right things. We weren't promoting the people for the right things. Or, by the way, the people really didn't share a set of beliefs about how to behave. You see, fit leads to performance. Now, here's where we run into trouble. Alignment is important and culture is important. But here's what's happening. Companies have aligned strategies are more likely to succeed. When they succeed, we put in processes and structures and metrics and KPIs. They make us successful. We have to do that. The only way we can get large organizations coordinated is we have to put in these systems and processes, and they make us successful. They also make it difficult to change. Separate from structure, when a company is successful, we develop cultures. Whether we're conscious of it or not, we develop cultures. Now, they make us successful, but fit leads to performance. Performance leads to inertia. It makes it more difficult to change the organization. We have inertia in our systems and processes. We have inertia in our capabilities and our culture. And if we're not careful, we have inertia in how we as leaders see the world. This is the trap. The very things that are making us successful, which are important, potentially make it difficult to change. So what's the solution? Well, logically, the solution is pretty straightforward. If you buy the notion of alignment as a way of executing strategy, then different strategies require different alignments. The alignment that it takes to compete in a big, mature business, a commodity business, is typically about efficiency, incremental improvement, compliance. But the alignment that it requires to compete in a new, fast-moving business is completely different. It's all about taking initiative and trying things and being resilient, So if you think about the alignment of a mature business, the kind of, in many instances, the big, old, successful Japanese companies, the Monozukuri alignment. It's all about efficiency and sort of compliance and kaizen and getting better and better and better. But if you think about the alignment that it takes to compete in these new businesses, it's completely different. The key success factors are different. The capabilities are different. The metrics and structures are different, and the culture's different. But that's the logic. And if you're going to be successful, then what it takes, I think, in the face of change, all right? So the firms that are able to manage culture are the firms that are successful. This is a study that was done at Harvard a number of years ago. What they found was culture by itself is not associated with performance. Even culture that's strategically aligned is not associated with performance. But culture that is strategically aligned, that can be adapted, then that is associated with performance. So here's where we end up. Where we end up is culture is important. It's critical for the execution of strategy, but it has to be, the leaders have to be able to adapt the culture for the new world. So let's think about how this works. If we are leaders of an organization and we are trying to change the organization, how do we align the culture? Well, again, the psychology is let's get very clear signals to people about how they need to behave. And let's use 5 levers, these 5 levers that we talked about. Let's think analytically about how we as leaders are going to behave. Think of the leadership team as a signal generator. It's broadcasting to the organization. And the question then is, what is the signal that is being sent by the senior team? Now, if we're in the organization, we know people are serious if they constantly say the same thing, if they are relentless at sending the same signals, if we get the same signals from the entire senior team, if what's important is always on the agenda, we're always talking about it. So that's the first lever, this notion of the leader as a signal generator. The second lever that we talked a little bit about is this notion of getting people involved. And again, the psychology is when we have people involved, they feel a sense of ownership. If all you get is the senior leaders say, here is the way we need you to behave, but they never listen to you, then we're not as psychologically engaged. So let's think about how we can get people involved in defining and changing the culture. And then let's think very carefully about, are we rewarding the right people? Do we take people who embody the culture and we say, this is what's important? Do we promote these people so others can see, yes, I see when I behave this way, this is important. And then can we make sure that we're sending vivid examples, emotional examples, stories about people who lived the culture and did something amazing. And finally, let's make sure that all our HR systems are lined up. We're selecting the right type of people. When we bring them into the company, we train them the right way. We're promoting them the right way. Again, these are the 5 levers. So let's go to Microsoft. Microsoft was founded by Bill Gates. He ran the company for many years. He turned it over to Steve Ballmer, who ran the company. And in 2013, Ballmer announced that he was going to step down. And in 2014, Business Week wrote an article about why the next CEO of Microsoft was going to have a problem. The Microsoft culture, reflecting both Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, was a very individualistic, aggressive, you had to know everything. But the company itself in 2014 was in deep trouble. Even though they were making money, they had 3 main markets. They sold software for using open source Linux. That market was declining. Their second market was their Office product. But people were beginning to use tablets. They were beginning to use, mobile devices, and that market was declining. So they're making money, but they're under real threat. And they bring in this fellow, Satya Nadella. And Satya Nadella stands up, and in his first meeting with the company, he makes this statement. He says, we have to change the strategy, but more importantly, we have to change the culture. And he says, our ability to change the culture is going to define whether we are successful or not. Okay? This is in 2015, right after he's appointed. Here's how they've done. You might remember, if you follow Microsoft, they have done since 2014, they've been amazing, and they have completely transformed themselves. Reed Hastings, the CEO of Netflix, is a board member of Microsoft, and Reed Hastings said the following: "This is one of those transformations that he has never seen." And so the question is, how did Satya Nadella come in and completely change Microsoft? First of all, Satya Nadella takes over, and the first thing he does with his senior team is he says, "I don't want any more yelling. I want you to read this book called Nonviolent Communication. All our meetings are now going to be calm, direct, candid, no yelling at people." And then he changes the structure, the Windows thing, and he restructures the organization. So he has a new strategy. They're going to move to the cloud. That's important. And he has a new structure. But then what he does is he begins to change the culture. And here's what he does. He spends 9 months with his senior leadership team, but also with focus groups, with meetings, with town halls. He's constantly asking people, what should the culture be for us to be successful? What should we keep and what do we need to change? At the end of 9 months, he gets his top 180 leaders together, and they spend 3 days deciding what the culture needs to be. And they come up with this notion of growth mindset. That is, we need to be a company where each of us is constantly trying to learn. We're not know-it-alls, we're learn-it-alls. And then what he does, 27,000 managers. They gave these managers explicit ways of helping them inculcate to drive the new culture, and they drove it into the organization. They got people involved. They had huge numbers of focus groups. They had town hall meetings with Nadella, getting feedback from him. They identified, through some network analysis, they identified the influencers in the organization, and they got them on board. They changed the annual meeting, which was really a meeting where the senior leaders would tell people what to do. They changed it into a 3-day hackathon that 17,000 people participate in. And then they constantly signal to the 130,000 employees, this is what the new culture looks like. They align the reward system. The big change they made here was, under the old system, the way people were rewarded was what's called a rank and yank system. They began to assess people on their growth mindset rather than on what they knew and didn't know. They changed the metrics in the organization so that people were rewarded not on individual metrics, but on shared metrics. All right. So the third lever is this notion of getting the reward system lined up. Under the old system, people were ranked. Every leader, every manager had to rank their employees, and the bottom 10% were put on performance improvement plans, or they were actually let go of the company. That created this very political environment. They changed that completely. And they changed the reward system so people were actually rewarded on their ability to behave according to this new growth mindset. They actually now have explicit interviews to make sure that people have the right culture before they're promoted to corporate vice presidents. And then they change the metrics so that people are now rewarded not on individual metrics, but also on shared metrics. They defined what their values meant. They took their values like diversity and inclusion, and they said, here are the 10 behaviors that describe diversity and inclusion. And they put them into the performance management system. They actually did a number of things that attracted a lot of attention by the employees. So not only did Nadella begin to not talk about Windows, but talk about cloud first, mobile first, but he actually, and this was a huge shock to the organization, and then they began to communicate this notion of a growth mindset throughout the organization, including, by the way, when meetings start, they often begin with a story about somebody who has done something that illustrates the culture. So people are constantly seeing, here's somebody who did something that our culture, and they have collected data to make sure that they're making progress. So they're measuring their progress. The last lever that they engaged in was they changed the HR system. They changed their performance management system. They changed their training system so that they now train people on growth mindset. They centralized all their training. As I said, they've trained 27,000 managers, and they've actually driven this into the organization. Notice the success. He changed from their Windows, he changed to cloud and mobile, he changed to open source. That by itself would never have succeeded under the old culture. He succeeded because he changed the culture. And he did it using these 5 levers. Asahi Glass Company is the world's largest maker of architectural and automotive glass, but those are commodity products. There's no growth in that. And so in 2014, when Shimomura-san and Hirai-san and Miyagi-san took over as the senior team, they decided that they would transform the company from a glass company to a material science company. And they did it in part through strategy. They were clear about their commodity businesses. The commodity businesses are supposed to generate cash, and they identified 3 areas of growth: mobility, electronics, and life sciences. They're leveraging their skills, their capabilities, into these new businesses. They've set up an ambidextrous organization, and Shimomura-san engaged an analyst report from a couple of months ago. Notice what's happened. The analysts are now seeing AGC not as a commodity company, but as a potential growth company. That's how successful they're being. How did he do it? The same way. What he did was he and his senior team began to communicate this. They were clear about what their strategy was. He sent emails to all the employees, said, this is what a bad manager looks like. This is what we need you to look like. He was relentless in getting people involved. For the 5 years that Shimomura-san was the CEO, he would make 50 site visits a year. He'd visit 50 separate sites. At each site, he would hold 3 town hall meetings with employees. So think about that. 50 times 3, 150 a year times 5. That's the number of organization. The only thing that AGC has not done, which Microsoft has done, the only thing they've done which is different is they've not really changed their HR system. So that's the message. So we're entering this DX. It is a world in which companies that do not change will be left behind. They will be in commodity businesses. They will become less and less and less relevant. In some cases, they will be broken up. If the leaders do not change the organization, if they do not change the culture, then they're going to be left behind. And the problem is that many leaders are going to ignore this. They're going to concentrate on trying to be a business that is being sort of commoditized and taken over by lower cost producers. So, and culture is a key to this. It's not the only key, but is the key that gets left out, in my experience. That leaders, unless they are prepared to manage culture, to realign culture, what's going to happen is the old culture is going to slow them down and new competitors are going to come along. So that's the message. The DX is here. It is already affecting organizations. The winners in the future are going to be leaders who can be ambidextrous, but that requires managing the cultures.
And I have 2 questions. So first one is about the timing. I mean the time because I want to know like how long does it take to change the culture usually, because nowadays the environment is changing very rapidly, and then CEO doesn't have so much time to change the culture, to adapt their culture to the strategy. And then like the second question is how like efficiently to achieve that. Like, for example, like there is any like the steps to achieve the culture change. For example, like just start a small start, like only the set of one division to change the culture.
So thank you, Jung-woo. That's a good, both of those are good questions. So first of all, with respect to timing, most people believe that it takes a long time to change culture, and especially in large organizations. It took Nadella probably 3 years before he got serious traction. I think that's 130,000 people. It took Mary Barra 3-4 years before there was significant change. So for big organizations, you can look at a 3 to 4 year, but I have seen other organizations change, also large organizations change comparatively quickly. I saw a 55,000 person organization change in 2 years. What made that perhaps easier was they were in deep trouble and they had a burning platform, a so-called burning platform. And the new CEO came in and everybody understood they needed to change. So that depends also on how forceful and how aligned these 5 levers are. So the larger issue of timing, I think, it can be done more quickly than I think, for large organizations, more quickly than I think some people would think. Your second question, if I understood it, was how about changing it in smaller units? And that obviously can be done much more quickly. A unit of 300, 400, 500 people, that can be done in 6 months, 12 months. What you're really trying to do is to get people to say, look, we need you to behave in a different way, or there are different behaviors. And again, culture change is not going from one to another. It is saying there are some things that we value that we want to keep, some behaviors, some patterns of behavior. And there are some things that we need to add, and maybe there are some things that we currently have that we need to diminish. So I think in smaller organizations, you can do it more quickly. A part of that question, I think, Jung-woo, if I understood you, is do we change the whole organization or do we change part of the organization? The difference with Microsoft and AGC is they were trying to transform the whole organization. Mm-hmm. To be ambidextrous, what you're trying to do is change the culture in a smaller unit, a more exploratory unit. That can be done very quickly. We have studied many organizations that have implemented the ryokike, the ambidextrous form. And in the new businesses, that can be done within a month, 2 months, 6 months. So the larger question becomes, do we need to transform the whole organization, or are we just transforming part of the organization? Does that answer the question, Jung-woo?
Yes, correct. So I think it is easier to change the smaller one. It's true, yeah. But yeah, I think it is the one way to how to achieve the transformation. Yeah.
But here's a problem that companies sometimes have. They recognize that they need to set up a different unit that has a different alignment and a different culture. But they use some of the same processes and constraints on that smaller unit. So even though the smaller unit understands they need to behave differently, the constraints from the larger example. So one of the organizations that we looked at that tried to set up a separate exploratory unit, they set up an exploratory unit, but they had to meet the same requirements for purchasing and legal and HR. Mm-hmm. And even though the smaller unit was trying to do things differently, every time they wanted to spend some money, every time they wanted to hire somebody, The large organization said, no, you have to comply with our regulations. And so that slows things down. So it requires some subtlety in understanding how to do this.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I found it really valuable, informative. It kind of sounded like this and needs its own department at companies because of how important culture is. And that made me think of Salesforce and Dreamforce, which for people who don't know, it's Salesforce's week-long convention that takes over San Francisco. And there's gear, multiple companies coming. It's a huge thing. But they have a whole company that is dedicated to Dreamforce, or they have a whole department that's dedicated to that. And so that kind of brings me to the question of capacity for different companies, because not all, or at least for the ones that were successful, a lot of the changes that they made, like the company you spoke of, who had 150 meetings, right? That takes a lot of personnel and a lot of resources, and not all companies have that. But let's say they are still looking to make those changes. So my first question is how can you scale the different levers? And then my second question is about culture's beginning, or culture is important from the beginning, not just when, you're a mid-level or large level company. So are these levers also accessible and useful for companies who are, let's say, startups who are trying to, enter into the market and make a name for themselves, and to use these to try to compete, especially in the culture of DX?
Yeah. So let me answer the last question first. Can smaller companies do this? They can do it. They can do it easier because there are fewer people. The leaders and the leadership team are accessible. They're visible to people. So the psychology is exactly the same. And it's easier to do that in smaller companies. My experience is with startups, until you get to about 50 people, then in a way you don't even need to be very explicit about it, because everybody sees each other, that they know each other, they communicate with each other. When you get to above 50 and you start to scale to 200-300, that's when you need to become more conscious about this. Let me go to your first question, which, if I understood it, was does it take a lot of resources? And the answer is no. I mean, the example of AGC with Shimomura-san making all these site visits, it took Shimomura-san and a couple of his people. He was going to visit the sites, or some of the sites anyway. So what it takes is discipline on the part of the senior team, and a willingness to be in some sense bored about it, because you can imagine if you're a leader and you've done 50-50, it's like, what? I don't want to do that. So another part of your question was, does it need a separate department? And I may not have understood you, but I got a little nervous when I heard that, because these successful culture change efforts take the commitment of the senior team. The minute a culture change effort is handed off to the HR department, for instance, then I start to worry, because people look and they say, well, it's an HR issue. So I think part of the secret of these organizations is they're constantly having these small events that has a big successful culture change effort. They have routinized this. So every month, in every department, there is a core value award winner. And they have these awards held up. We're honored for living the culture. So it's a disciplined process. It's more than an annual event. It's more than an HR event. And the scaling part requires this relentless attention to this. In the Microsoft example, managers, that took significant effort. But that was a huge culture change for the organization. In many organizations, the culture change is more incremental. It is, we're going to stop doing this, we're going to start doing this. So again, it requires a level of consciousness rather than lots of resources. Does that make sense, Emily?
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
First, you mentioned that the organizational culture is very important, both private sector and in the public sector. And I think often in Japan, it is said that organizational culture of the government is too traditional and needs to be changed. However, I believe that public sector is slow to change because there's no possibility to bankruptcy or reduced profits. So can such a change in organizational culture occur in the public sector as such? I think if the government changes, especially in Japan, that becomes more efficient, I believe many Japanese companies will also change that. My second question is also, I'm curious about the impact of the pandemic, how about managing culture. So I think even in Japan is very behind the digitalization. Even in such a country, the necessity of working remotely has both its. But I think after the pandemic, the workers have online meetings or they do even small talk by online chat. So if this change in working style have a bad effect or good effect on the managing culture, and how should we tackle this?
Okay, great. So thank you. So the public-private, you're correct that public organizations, because they typically don't go out of business and because are slower to change. It's also with public organizations, it's harder to change the reward system. But notice, I'm not suggesting that the reward systems are tied to money necessarily. It's recognition, it's approval, it's honoring people for living the values. The psychology is the same. So public organizations the culture change in public organizations can proceed the same way. I've seen this happen in a number of public. So I spent a little time with the Swiss Post Office, for instance. I think there's no reason that a public organization can't change. They're subject to some constraints. The second question about the pandemic, I think I agree with you if I understood your point, that because we have now been sort of working at a distance, we don't get together because we're not around except for our Zoom meetings. We're often not around our colleagues. And so we're not interacting with them on a daily basis. We're not socializing with them. And so we can form norms about how we interact on Zoom, but we don't have the identification with the larger organization. And I think that's a serious problem. And we're seeing that, at least in the US, we're seeing that now with some organizations are saying, you've got to come into work at least 3 days a week. So if some, and I have been asked this, if people said, can you really manage a culture change from a distance? And my answer is probably not.
So my question is, how can we train ourselves to better become people who can bring these changes? And also, if you have any thoughts on, is it better if it's someone who has been in that company culture for a while and really understands the culture, or if it's better to bring someone from outside who can really bring different insights and change?
So I recognize that younger people do not have the leverage to actually change culture. You, as a young leader responsible for a group of people, you can do some of these things. That was the point for Yasu-san. We can still do these things as a junior leader. But if you have senior leaders who are simply unwilling to change, then it's very difficult.
Maybe if you could talk about, is it better to have somebody as a leader someone who has been in that company for a long time and really understands the culture, or?
Thank you. So, the superficial intuition is that, a new person coming in should be better able to change the organization. They have a different mindset. They have different experiences. They can change it. And there are examples. So IBM was failing in the early 90s, and they brought in, for the first time ever, they brought in a CEO from the outside, a fellow named Lou Gerstner. He transformed the company. On the other hand, if you look at Microsoft, Nadella had been at the company for 22 years. Shimomura-san at AGC had been. So the problem often is that outsiders, when they are brought in, they don't know the company. So Kodak in the early 90s saw the digital revolution coming, and they brought in an outsider to transform the company. And he failed. He failed completely because he didn't understand the company, and he wasn't willing to make the hard decisions necessary. So I don't think it's clear whether you need there are advantages to having somebody who's been in the company for a while, like Satya Nadella or Shimomura-san or Hasegawa-san at Takeda Pharmaceuticals. These are all people that were in the company, knew the company, but had a vision about the future. So I think it can work, or not work either way. I think it depends on the individual. There's no easy answer to that question.
My first comment is maybe related to what Eddie-san was kind of talking about the public sector. So this summer, I actually interned at the U.S. Department of State in a science policy office. And right now, the State Department is undergoing an organizational, cultural change. And now that I've actually listened to this presentation, it's really put into perspective my experience there. And I was just wondering if you had any real world examples where maybe a company had cultures that were well aligned for each of those two segments, but where the two of them didn't collaborate well and still led to failure.
So let me try to answer. So an exploit culture is, exploit is kind of a derogatory term. A core business is, the cultures are typically around sort of getting incrementally better, staying close to customers, sort of driving efficiency, being compliant with all the procedures and the processes. An explore culture is typically more around experimentation, trying new things, rapidly adjusting sort of thing. So that's the essence of ambidexterity, of running those two organizations. We have seen a number of successes and failures, and the failures often happen in part for what we were talking about earlier, when the exploit organization, even though they set up this separate business, they require that business to meet all the requirements of the core business. So we saw one big, very exploit organization set up a new business. It started to grow, but they kept requiring the new business to meet the requirements around hiring. And it just drove the people crazy. They couldn't make offers fast enough. They couldn't respond to customers quickly enough because they had to go back to the larger organization. So we've seen some examples of failures, but they're typically failures not of intent. It's not that the big organization is saying, I don't want them to succeed. It's the big organization is being rewarded for making sure everybody is doing the right thing. And HR is sometimes a part of that, that they have all these rules and regulations for good reasons. They're losing business. They're not know what's going to happen. The people in the US business are now frustrated and they're leaving. So it's very easy for us as academics to say, well, you should have a core business and you should have an explore business. It's quite difficult to run these businesses. So we've seen successes, and you're right, we've seen failures.
What sparked my interest was the Kodak example.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of interested in the process of how you identify the norms or the processes that are causing problems. I know in his soundbite, the CEO or the former CEO talked about how it was Kodak's politeness.
Yeah.
But in my how I think about it is there could be many, issues that are causing problems. I'm interested in that process of how you can identify these things. And I'm wondering if it's also a little bit of trial and error, or I'm sure that there are some that are more obvious than others.
Yeah. So it doesn't have to be trial and error, actually. And again, we know how to diagnose cultures. And let me give you just an example about how to do that. If I say I want to be, so my strategy is to be more innovative. And therefore, in this business, to be more innovative, I've got to do 3 or 4 things. I then ask myself, well, what are the behaviors that I need for people to do these 3 or 4 key success factors? They have to be faster. They have to be quick to opportunities. They have to be flexible. I can now do a diagnosis of what's currently rewarded. I can do that with focus groups. There are a number of instruments that one can use to do that. Microsoft did it largely through focus groups. So I ask existing employees, how do you have to behave to be successful? And if we did this at Kodak, for instance, they would say things, well, the way you have to be successful as an individual is you don't challenge your boss publicly, for sure. You build relationships, you socialize ideas, you get, so what we would learn is the current culture is slow, polite, not challenging. Doesn't mean that they aren't interested in doing things, but and then we look at what the culture is that we need, and we say, well, the behaviors that we have now, we want to continue those. So if in the old culture that we might say, well, we're a high integrity organization, well, we want to keep that. But in the new organization, we have to be a lot faster. So I think, Emily, there are ways of diagnosing culture that we know how to do. We've done this for some of our research and the like. So there are ways to do that. And I'm looking at Yasu-san, and I'm thinking about, as a consultant, Yasu-san could easily meet with people and get them to describe kind of, let's be honest, let's be candid. What do you have to do to be successful today? And then you could ask the senior managers, especially of the Explore unit, well, if you're going to execute your new innovation strategy, how do people need to behave? And let's get concrete about it. Let's not just say, well, they need to be more flexible. Let's be clear about what that looks like. That's what they did at Microsoft.
I have one question about the skill, because the culture change, I think it often is accompanied by the skill change. My client was providing the IT system to their parent company, and then the parent company is only the customer. So what my client need to do is only produce the IT very exactly what their parent company said. But the environment changed and their strategy also changed. So now they need to sell their product to external client. Then the required skill is very different. So they need to be customer centric. Then they need to suggest the solution based on the customers pain point or something like that. So what my question is how to deal with that kind of skill change problem. So do we need to, because it is impossible to fire most of them.
So it's a skill change problem, but it's also a culture change problem. So if I understood you, they need to be more customer centric. They need to, that's a skill set. And that's a skill set. That's a skill set that can be trained to people. Mm-hmm. That how to conduct interviews, how to ask questions, how to not tell your client what they need to do, but ask a set of questions and help them understand what they need to do. There may be technical skills that need to be added, but part of that is a culture change effort. Let me give you a real example of that. We're going to see what happens in the next 5 years now. So you know that Intel, the big American semiconductor company, They have been selling high-end microprocessors, and they are a technology company. They make these micro data centers largely, right? They have now announced that they want to be a foundry like TSMC. They want to be able to sell, to use their manufacturing base to manufacture chips from other people, all right? That's a huge culture change. That is, they say we want to leverage our manufacturing capability, but unless they learn how to interact with customers in the way TSMC does, they will never succeed. If we were to do the culture diagnosis of what the culture at Intel is today and what the culture is they need to be a successful foundry, they are very different cultures. So there may be some technical skills they need to add, but they also need to engage in a culture change. And if they fail at that culture change, then they will not succeed. So I parcel out how much of the skill set do we need new skills that we need to bring people in, or maybe we can train people. The interesting thing about Komori-san with the transformation of Fujifilm is they actually took chemical engineers and they trained them as electronic engineers because of the desire on the part of Japanese companies not to lay people off. They actually retrain people. So that is potentially an option. But so I would try to separate out how much is a skill problem and how much is a culture problem. So I want to, by way of wrap up, let me thank all the participants. It was fun interacting with you. But let me thank IGPI as well. I think my experience of IGPI is it's a company that is on the leading edge of Korea's companies transform themselves. So it's a privilege for me to be able to participate in this. So thank you. Thank all your colleagues at IGPI.